good to have you in Toledo. Is this your first time?
It is actually. It's my first time in Toledo.
Have you had a chance to see anything, or did you fly in?
No. We drove from Michigan, so I got to see the Jeep factory on the way in.
That's the highlight of the drive down 75
Well, you know,
South.
the funny thing is, I was mentioning when I got here that my first car was a Jeep Cherokee, so it was kind of nice to see as I drove by.
You should stick around. We're having Jeep Fest this coming weekend.
Really?
We're going to have 60,000 people and thousands of Jeeps on the streets of downtown.
No
Toledo.
kidding.
We're pretty proud of it.
Well, you should be. It's a great car.
Where are you from? You're from the Northeast.
I grew up in Rhode Island.
And you went to Connecticut College, right?
I did.
So you're kind of a New Englander?
I am a New Englander.
We won't hold that against you. You wrote the book, The Briefing.
Yes.
You had some things you wanted to tell and get off your chest, I imagine, after your time in the White House.
Well, it wasn't. I think there's two aspects. One is I kept getting asked, how does this kid from Rhode Island
wind up there?
I wanted to at least be able to explain that piece of it, and then obviously, not just the White House, but go back and talk about the primary process, the convention, the general election, the debates, the transition. There's so much going on at such a fast pace, and I think as I've been out on the speaking circuit, the interesting thing was how many people were sort of jumping to, I read that this is how that went down, or this went down, or this is, and I felt like there was so much to actually tell about what had happened that I wanted to kind of dial back and not just give my version of it, but I went back and talked to the key players that were there for part of it and said, okay, what do you also remember about what was going on in the convention floor? What was happening in terms of what did our data show us? And be able to lay out for readers and viewers a little bit more than they might have seen or heard as far as what's going on in the last couple of years.
You worked in several campaigns before. How did the Trump campaign differ from some of the other political campaigns you had been in?
Like almost in every way.
Just a complete 180 from everything else.
Yeah.
From our side, from the press side, dealing with the Trump campaign was unlike dealing with anybody.
Right, and I think part of the reason I wanted to write that book was because I don't think that people fully appreciate the relationship that existed between where I was, the Republican National Committee, and the campaign, the dynamic and the process and the partnering that existed, and why that's so important. Because for a lot of folks, because it was so different, when we went in and tried to explain it to folks in the press, pundits, et cetera, influencers, they would sort of say, well, that's just not how it works. And our point was, you're right. But in a lot of ways, I actually think it was a great model going forward, meaning that the party absorbed a lot of the functions and the resources that make a lot more sense than trying to have a campaign that's limited in the amount of dollars it can take because of federal law, and the party can take a much greater amount of donation, so that it actually, from a resource sharing perspective, made a lot of sense. And in a lot of ways, I look at it as in some ways, a great model going forward.
From your chair at the RNC, at what point did you think Donald Trump would become the nominee? And then when did you realize that he actually couldn't make it as president? Was there a point, or were you in doubt the entire way?
So as far as him becoming the nominee, somewhere around, after Iowa, you saw that there was a massive committed amount, and that if no one was intending to drop out, which was the case, that he clearly was on a path to get the requisite number of delegates, and it didn't look like anybody else had a model that showed that could occur. And as it proved out, that was the case. There was never a moment when anybody could do a math equation that showed that because the other folks weren't dropping out, that they could get the amount necessary to do that. He wrapped up, he became the presumptive nominee in May after the Indiana primary, and I think at that point, there was this question, okay, can he win? And that's where that partnership really started to make sense, is that
you got to start working on it.
We started to realize that, hey, this actually can work because of the groundwork that we had laid in both the data operation and the field operation, that we realized if we actually created a true partnership, this could work. The data kept showing that there was a path forward, but it was going to be narrow. And we knew that, I write about this in the book, that there were states, Ohio being one of them, that we knew we had a path to victory, but the trajectory was such that we had to keep hitting key milestones.
And you were hitting the milestones, but every time a milestone was hit, something else would
correct,
happen.
and that's exactly right.
Something.
Right, that's the point, is that you would see this ebb and flow. The interesting thing is that I put one of the charts in the books that shows sort of absolutely what you're talking about, that we'd hit this roadblock, bounce back a little bit, but within a few days, we'd rebound back to where we were.
Unlike anything I've ever seen in politics, to rebound so quickly from some destructive reports and stories.
And I've said this before. I mean, but he as a candidate went through so many hurdles that should have and frankly would have stopped any other candidate. So, we knew there was this path going forward, and I talk about in the book that there was this swath of voters that kind of cut across every one of the battleground states and fit the same mold, which was people who were high propensity Republican voters that would never vote Democrat but had a hard time voting for Trump. And our political team basically made a bet after looking at a number of focus groups which said that if we can present these people with a binary choice, if we can get them an early ballot, an absentee ballot, or get them in a voting booth, that by overwhelming majority they'd vote for Trump. And so there was this effort put in the final days to really get these folks out to the polls. And the interesting thing was, I mentioned we came over here from Michigan. We won Michigan by 0.3. Our model had us winning by 0.2. It was a game of precision.
After you deliver the White House, at what point were you offered the job as the press secretary, and did you take that voluntarily? Did you walk into that with eyes wide open? Why would you take that job?
At the time, I was offered the job on December 22nd, just after noon. I'd gone downstairs in Trump Tower. I had a salad for lunch. I remember it clear as day.
A couple of shots afterwards, maybe a nice tall bourbon.
That later that night, maybe. And I remember walking upstairs and sitting in my office and the phone ringing. I knew the number, and it came in. It was the president-elect at the time. And he said, hey, let's do this. I want you on the team. And I told him, I look forward to doing this. I'll work as hard as I can to do everything I can in your best interest, in the country's best interest. And, life changed, significantly from that day forward.
Any regrets?
Of course. I've said this before. I mean, I look at life as a fairly reflective person, meaning whether it's a personal interaction, an interview, a meeting, whether it's personal or professional, and say, was that the best that I could have done that day? Was that the strongest interaction I could have had with that person?
In the briefing, you talk about that very first day at the podium,
right,
and how it was kind of your first impression with the president, first impression with the press,
right,
first impression with the public, and a lot of things could have gone differently.
Correct. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I mean, if there's one day in my life right now that I could have a do-over, that would be it. That really, I think, set the tone going forward. On a lot of levels, people have asked me, well, which part? I'm like, all. Right, everything.
Yes, everything.
And of course, there are days and moments that I wish we could have done differently or better, to be more precise. But that's not how you live life. And I would rather say, did I learn from that moment? How am I going to make sure that I do a better job going forward?
Do you think things are more adversarial in the press room since your departure? I mean, my uncle covered the White House in the 70s, and I talked with him about it, and the press secretary, in his opinion, should be an advocate for the press to get information out, and it seems like it's completely different today.
And I don't necessarily fully agree with that, but I do think that there's no question that it has taken on a much more adversarial role. I think, but the other thing that I think is interesting is that if you look at that press room, there's 49 seats, but there's let's call it 100 people that pack that room every day, probably a little more. I think that you have a vocal minority that sort of leads the pack, but there's a lot among others. But I think that it's not one person or one group. That there are a handful of folks that there might be more or less of an issue with, but there's some reporters in there that A, do a really good job, and B, that I think folks get along with just great. But I think that what you see on television a lot makes it seem a lot more adversarial.
What's next for you?
I've got a podcast called Everything's Going to Be All Right. We've done a lot of public speaking. The book tour continues for the next month or so. And then I've got a consulting firm that advises, senior level folks about how to create effective communication strategies.
Well, welcome to Toledo.
Thank you for having me.
I have to talk to you on the show again soon.
You bet. Love it.
Thanks, Sean.
You bet.